For this activity, you will need paper, a pencil, an eraser, watercolor paint, some water and brushes, and some shells. If you don't have shells around the house, I have attached a picture of some shells to this video, which you can find at the bottom in the description. For this artwork, we're going to practice layering things on top of each other. You can arrange your shells how you would like, and if you find it a little bit confusing with the picture, you might even be able to print it out, cut out the different shells, and then lay them on top of each other as a collage reference for your artwork. I'm just placing the shells on the table to give myself a rough idea of what I want to draw. You can also draw the arrangement that I've put on the table. Just simply press pause on the video and then draw it as you can see it. To draw my shells, I like to start with a cross, and then I will do the top sweeping semicircle, and then I will bring it down to the bottom where it has that rounded triangle point, and then add the two little side bits that are attached to it, which kind of look like little triangles as well. I then draw my next shell straight over the top of it, as I am looking at it on the table. So this one is more straight on, and I'm going to draw it so that it overlaps with the shell underneath it. I'm not worried about those lines at the moment. Once I have all my shells laid out, then I'll use my rubber to come back in and erase all the bits and pieces that I no longer need. But I find it much easier when starting to draw each shell as a whole and then come back in and remove the different parts. And we just keep drawing all of our different shells until our page is full. For our cone shell, I like to draw each individual section, so that real bottom squarish look, and then the next section up, and so on and so forth until you get to the top of the shell. And you can go back over and join and change the lines a little bit in case it looks a little bit too blockish. Because remember, we're going to come back in with our rubber and clean up any of the lines that we're not happy with. Before I get into adding any of the detail, now I like to get in with my rubber and remove any of those lines that I don't need. I'm looking at some of my guidelines, and I'm also looking at the lines that now are sitting underneath what's going to be on top. So look at where those shells are overlapping and just erase any of the shell that's underneath it, and it'll instantly start to look like it's becoming a little bit more 3D. Now that I have the foundation of my picture drawn, I'm going to start adding those details. So those straight lines that come from the middle of the base of the shell and then they fan all the way out, that curvy outline around the top where it swirls up and down, any of the different patterns, I'm adding all the different parts of detail that I need for my picture. Once we've finished our drawing, it's time to paint. Now, if you've done our first shell drawing, you'll see that I've done this the exact opposite as I started with the other one, and that's to show you a different way that you can paint. Now, what I'm doing is I'm starting with my darkest point, and that for this shell is the patterns. I'm getting my really dark brown and I am coloring it in all the different parts that are the darkest. I'm going to do this to my whole picture, so finding all the darkest parts and coloring them in first. Once I've colored in the darkest part, I'm then going to make a really light wash, and I'm doing that by adding white with my light brown and a lot of water into the lid of my palette. And then I'm going to just roughly color in the whole of my shell. So I'm not worried if I'm going to color over my dark parts, because you'll notice as it dries, those lighter colors will actually absorb the darker colors underneath, and they will become a little bit more defined. So it might look a little bit strange right now to just pop a whole bunch of white paint over the top of that dark that we just made, but you will see as it dries that it will start to separate and become lighter and darker once again. I'm then going to use straight white paint to add some real highlight areas, and that is some bright areas onto my shells. And then while that's drying, I'm moving on to my next shell and I'm doing the same process again. So adding those really dark pattern areas all over my whole shell, and then adding a wash and then adding the highlights. While I'm waiting for those shells to dry, I go back to my first ones and I start coloring in the shadowy areas. So I'm no longer just focusing on the pattern areas, I'm also looking at the darker parts because of where the light and the shadows change it. That's those shadowy areas between the ridges where it swirls up and down, and also where it casts a shadow onto itself. You'll notice when I'm painting with watercolor that I move between one object to the other, and that's so that I can allow for different areas to dry. When I paint over it, you'll get those really clean colors and it'll stop the colors from mixing and bleeding together. You'll also notice the difference between painting like this and the other shell video is that these shells look a little bit softer and a little bit less defined. This is just a completely different way and style to paint with watercolor. For this, I'm also choosing to create a really rough outline, and I'm going to do that with black paint. You can do it with dark brown or another color, but for me, I just love the look of a nice, crisp, dark outline. I'm not being too particular about it, meaning I'm not being really exact. I'm just kind of creating a really rough, fast looking outline for my more softer looking shell painting. I'm using a smaller brush for this. So you want to be using your big brushes to be doing big colorful areas, and you want to be using your small brushes for doing smaller detailed areas. Now that my shells are finished on my page and I've got all the outlines that I would like, I'm also going to add a really light shadow of where my shells sit on top of each other and on top of my bench. And I do that by mixing a little bit of black paint with a lot of water on my palette. I'm not outlining my whole shell, I'm just looking at where the shadow is on my table, and I'm going to draw that onto my picture. And this will just create a little bit of an illusion of shells sitting on top of your piece of paper. To make it look a little bit rougher, because these shells aren't an exact style of painting, I'm adding a few little bits of drops and dribbles of paint around it. And we're done.